This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
Doug. Here we have the Limu Emu in its natural habitat, helping people customize their car insurance and save hundreds with Liberty Mutual. Fascinating. It's accompanied by his natural ally, Doug.
Limu? Is that guy with the binoculars watching us?
Cut the camera. They see us.
Only pay for what you need at libertymutual.com.
Liberty, 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 liberty.
Savings vary. Underwritten by Liberty Mutual Insurance Company and affiliates. Excludes Massachusetts.
Yesterday, on the eve of a government shutdown, President Trump had a message for the American people. This message was not about what services we might expect to lose in the coming days. It wasn't an announcement of some bipartisan compromise either. It was something else entirely.
So, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming the 45th and 47th President of the United States, our Commander-in-Chief, Donald J. Trump.
The president was speaking in front of a room full of generals and admirals in full dress uniform. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth was his warm-up act. And when Trump took the stage, everyone stood, but almost no one clapped.
I've never walked into a room so silent before. This is very... Don't laugh. You're not allowed to do that. You know what? Just have a good time. And if you want to applaud...
Idris, can you just sum up what happened at Quantico in one word?
Bizarre, I think would be the word I would use.
Idris Ali covers the Pentagon for Reuters. He was watching this rare gathering at Marine Base Quantico from a distance because not a lot of press was allowed into the room. Ahead of time, there had been speculation about what might happen here. Would generals be fired? Would some new operation get announced? In the end, this was something much more Trumpian. No firings, just the threat of firings all around. No declaration of war, but a drawing of battle lines for sure, for an internal battle. It began with the president listing off cities.
But it seems that the ones that are run by the radical left Democrats, what they've done to San Francisco, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, they're very unsafe places, and we're going to straighten them out one by one. And this is going to be a major part for some of the people in this room. That's a war, too. It's a war from within. Control.
After Trump championed a war from within, he suggested using these cities as military proving grounds.
It's really a very important mission. And I told Pete, we should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military, National Guard, but military. Because we're going into...
And his comments, I think in the speech, were pre-start because they made clear that the priority going forward for the U.S. military could be internal and not external.
What the president seemed to be doing was trying to make a tacit agreement with everyone in that room. Not explicit, not you're loyal to me or else, but this is what I'm doing. Get on board. And it seemed to step up to a line.
Yeah, I think on the one hand, people will sort of be looking at this through what we've talked about, which is this was really bizarre. This was really confusing. What was the intent of this? But I also think there might be a part of them thinking, wow, this was maybe a bit bizarre and confusing, but it could have been a lot worse. There was no sort of blood oath required. There was no situation where they had to get up and applaud everything.
That's so interesting. I hear you say that, and I'm like, it doesn't get that much worse. Like, yes, it could have been worse, but worse is really bad.
Well, the bar was low, but it was cleared.
For me, this raises another question. How low is the Pentagon's bar these days? Today on the show, how Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump's big meeting explains the way America's military is changing from the top down. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. This episode is brought to you by Saks Fifth Avenue. With the weather getting cooler, if you're like me, you're looking around for a couple of new items for your wardrobe, like a new sweater, some cute new kicks. And Saks Fifth Avenue makes it easy to get creative with your personal style and find the best arrivals for fall. I went over to Saks.com to check out what they've got on tap, and I gotta say, what I love about clicking around their website is that every piece looks special, one of a kind, as if you'd walk into the office or a party and instantly grab everyone's attention. All the big brands are there, stuff like Alice and Olivia, you know, the young and trendy stuff. I love that I can see the care in every piece Saks has chosen for their fall collections. Each dress or pant or shoe feels a little bit elevated. So if you want shopping to be fun and easy, head over to Saks Fifth Avenue for inspiring ways to elevate your personal style every day.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today? Smart choice. Progressive loves to help people make smart choices. And that's why they offer a tool called Auto Quote Explorer that allows you to compare your Progressive car insurance quote with rates from other companies. So you can save time on the research and can enjoy savings when you choose the best rate for you. Give it a try after this episode at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states and situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
Okay, I'm hoping to just go through the speeches in some depth one by one, because I think there are important things in each speech that tease out what's been going on over the last few months at the Pentagon that people may have missed. So can you set the scene a little bit in Quantico? Like, what were your colleagues seeing in the room when these speeches were made?
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that Reuters itself was not in the room. We were not credentialed. There aren't many journalists who I know who were credentialed. So our eyes and ears were essentially these pool cameras, which are, networks that are basically broadcasting for the rest of the media. And so our eyes and ears were very much these cameras. And, it started pretty early in the morning, around 7:30. You could see the generals and admirals walking into the room.
That feels very military.
Feels very military. 7:30 is probably a bit late for most of them, right? So they walk into the room half an hour before they need to be there. They sit down and you see the top U.S. General Dan Kane, appear in the room. He gives a short speech welcoming the Defense Secretary. And then the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, starts by speaking at the lectern. He was standing sort of at a podium. Behind him was the American flag, really large. And in front of him were two billboards that read, Strength, Service, America. And as soon as he started speaking, he moved away from the lectern and essentially started pacing back and forth. Sort of the Fox News host in him almost came out. And, that really set the stage for the day.
So Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, actually, are we calling him Secretary of War now? Does Reuters have a policy on that?
Reuters' policy is to say Defense Secretary on first reference, and then on second reference, say that, they have sought to change the name, but Congress has not yet approved it. All
right. So Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, he had said the purpose of this meeting was to talk about his vision for the military and the warrior ethos. Is that what he did? Where did he begin his speech?
Yeah, I think that's really an interesting question, because the speech really did start off by going after what he sort of saw as diversity, inclusion, and equity sort of measures within the Pentagon, and sort of his view that he mentions pretty often about how, the Pentagon is just not focused on warfighting anymore. It is more focused on these, diversity initiatives.
Is that true?
If you are in the military, you are probably not spending a lot of time on DEI initiatives. You are spending your time training. Does that mean that there aren't initiatives that take a bit of time? No. But I think this emphasis on how much time the military is spending is really out of sync with what we're seeing in reality. And it really just doesn't add up.
Yeah, he said no more dudes in dresses, no more climate change worship. We're done with that shit. And just an aside, lots of cursing in this speech.
Lots of cursing in this speech because I think Hegseth and Trump have a certain vision of what a U.S. Military service member looks like. And in their view, or in their, sort of, if you were to stereotype it, they see someone, probably male, probably white, who is probably really fit and probably swears a lot. And I think we saw that coming out in the way Secretary Hegseth was speaking about, the troops and to the generals and admirals as well.
Yeah, aesthetics were really top of mind for Hegseth. Like, he talked about how he doesn't want fat soldiers. He talked about how he wants people clean shaven. Can we talk a little bit about that focus? Because his focus, like, for instance, the clean shaven thing, it privileges certain people, right?
It does. It again sort of goes back to that view of what Hegseth sees as a service member. Hegseth himself has served. And I think he has this ideal view of someone who's probably really strong and doesn't have facial hair. I think there was a phrase in there where he said, we're looking for people who are in the military, who are willing to accept these grooming standards and not beardos, referring to people with beards as being weird. And I think throughout the speech, we sort of were able to really peel back the layers and see what Hegseth and Trump both saw as a U.S. military service member. And it's not probably someone who is, again, female or diverse.
I mean, Black men are more likely to get these painful razor bumps if they shave, right? So that's part of why grooming standards were loosened?
Right. And it's something that really hasn't been that controversial, if I'm being honest. It's not something that too many people really focus on. But Hegseth is, because he is a former Fox News personality and looks matter. And I think that was very clear today.
He also talked about raising fitness standards to a quote unquote male standard. How would that impact women who are serving?
So this is something he's actually been talking about for a couple of months, and the Army has already done. And, I want to be fair. Hegseth said this is not about removing women from the military. But the unintended or intended consequence will be, if you have everyone who is at the same benchmark, regardless of biological factors, some people aren't going to make it. And I think there has been fear for months that this is sort of an underhand way to maybe not have women in some of the roles. Hegseth says that's not true, but the consequence, I think, is going to be exactly that.
Yeah. Secretary Hegseth also seems eager to change what accountability looks like in the military. And he spoke about that at some length. He talked about not punishing people for earnest mistakes they may have made in their careers. What was that about?
I think that was sort of one of the most important parts of Secretary Hegseth's speech. He is being investigated by the Inspector General, who's really looking at his conduct of using Signal for what at the time was considered the Yemen war plans.
This is Signalgate, where somehow a journalist was randomly added.
Right. The really well-known Signalgate. And so he's being sort of looked at by the Inspector General. And during the speech, he said there are going to be reforms. And not just in the Inspector General, which is supposed to be independent, but the equal opportunity process by which people can complain, make complaints for, situations where they're feeling discriminated. And also sort of he went after anonymous reporting for issues. He said sexual assault is bad, but he seemed to sort of downplay it in ways. And so this real mechanism that the military has worked on for decades to improve is now being questioned by the Secretary of Defense. And, we've seen him take some sort of actions already in this regard, but bringing it up in front of generals and admirals, I thought was quite extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, some have basically speculated that these kinds of moves he's talking about, where it is harder to file a complaint or harder to get that complaint to stick in someone's personnel file, it simply opens up a system that protects abusers, violent people, people who you wouldn't want serving in the military.
That would have been the presumption, I think, for decades in the military, that not everyone in the military is perfect. And I think for decades, military leaders have said, we acknowledge that, and we want to have processes to make it better. And not necessarily for some altruistic reasons, but the fact is, if you have people like the ones who would be, carrying out sexual assault or discriminating, that's not going to want other people to join the military. And so it's a real self-interest for them to have people in the military who sort of follow rules and weed out the ones who don't. And I think this is, again, going to make it really interesting and potentially quite tough to recruit people. Because if you're a woman or a Black person and you're hearing the Secretary of Defense say, well, the equal opportunity process is just really bad, or, sexual assault is bad, but people are wrongly accused, I think you're probably going to think twice about whether you want to join the military or not.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
At Blinds.com, it's not just about window treatments. It's about you, your style, your space, your way. Whether you DIY or want the pros to handle it all, you'll have the confidence of knowing it's done right. From free expert design help to our 100% satisfaction guarantee, everything we do is made to fit your life and your windows. Because at Blinds.com, the only thing we treat better than windows is you. Visit Blinds.com now for up to 50% off primetime deals and free professional installation. Rules and restrictions apply.
Hey, it's Anna Sale, host of Death, Sex, and Money, the podcast from Slate about the things we think about a lot and need to talk about more. And recently we asked you to tell us stories about your beauty interventions, what you've decided to invest time and money in to improve your appearance.
So I looked at my dad, and I looked at him carefully. I said, no. We are going to sail in a different direction than this.
We heard from people who spent thousands on plastic surgery, fillers, and skincare routines, and from others who decided to reject pressure, like covering grays.
It's kind of like, why do I need to do that?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for you? Is it for you? Or because you're embarrassed to have a friend or a spouse with gray hair? I mean, what is the encouragement from?
And you told us about feeling caught between viewing appearance improvements as vanity and recognizing how much looking a certain way affects your relationships, career, and self-worth.
I'd like to think of myself as a person with depth, a person who values intelligence and kindness, and yet sometimes I worry that my appearance and the doors that my appearance have opened, those are going to close if I don't continue to look this particular way.
Listen to this episode and more Death, Sex, and Money episodes wherever you get podcasts.
So after Hegseth spoke, Trump entered the room. I noticed in his speech, it did this thing that a lot of Trump speeches do, which it wandered. It can be hard, I think, to maintain focus in one of these hour-plus speeches from Trump. And, of course, the generals, admirals in that room, their whole thing is to maintain focus. Do you think any of them were struggling with that here?
I'll go back to the fact that this seemed like a stream of thought from Trump. And, if you're used to it, if you're a White House correspondent, you probably have a really good mechanism for dealing with it and strategies for focusing. I don't cover the White House. I don't listen to President Trump every time he speaks. And so for me, it was a bit tough because, he would start talking about one thing and then switch to the other thing. Generals and admirals are very good at being deadpan, I have found. And so there was no sign of that I noticed. But again, they are trained for this. They are trained not to show any emotion, not to show any overt signs of praise or otherwise. And, I think they did a pretty good job not suggesting that the speech was meandering and maybe going a bit long.
We talked a bit about the headline from the speech, the talk from Trump about using the U.S. military in American cities. I want to just make one more point about that part of the speech, which is that using the military in that way, most military people are trained that it's illegal to do that, right?
So we are getting into a very interesting part of sort of military law. there are some real limitations about what the military can do when it comes to policing efforts. And there's actually a very specific part of the law known as the posse comitatus, which essentially limits how much of an interaction U.S. service members can have internally. Now, as always, there is an exception. And if the president chose to essentially invoke the Insurrection Act, he could use U.S. service members against Americans in the United States legally. So to answer your question, there is little precedent for American service members to be in U.S. cities policing, but there are legal carve-outs that would allow it to do them. But it doesn't make it any more jarring when the president says something like, we should use some of these dangerous cities as training for grounds for our military. You know, the U.S. military works all around the world and carries out operations that would probably be legally questionable in the United States. And so I think comments like that probably make a lot of people's sort of hair on their arms, rise.
Yeah. I mean, a former Lieutenant General, Mark Hertling, got on social media after watching this speech and said simply, once again, I'm reminded trust is gained in drops and lost in buckets. What would it mean if President Trump was losing the trust of the people who are at the tippy top of the military?
The military is essentially an all-volunteer force. And so the American military depends on the trust of the American people to send their sons and daughters to war. There is no draft, so you can't force anyone to actually join, for now at least, right? And so if that sort of public trust erodes, I think it is a huge problem. And I think people in the military are very, very aware of it, and they're very scared about it.
Did they talk to you about that?
It's been a constant thing that we have heard from sources, not necessarily after the speech, but it is a big, big concern amongst the top echelon of the uniformed military. They rely on the American people. They believe they have a social contract with the American people where, we, the U.S. military, will keep you safe and protect us as long as we are honest and open and transparent to you. And so, if you're a top general right now, you yourself are probably really good at carrying out orders that even if you don't agree with them. But I think sort of the down effect of what this means for recruiting and for the relationship with the American people, with their military, I think that's going to be really concerning.
I want to talk about how this event at Quantico fits into a wider pattern of what you're seeing at Secretary Hegseth's Pentagon. Recently, the armed forces announced a kind of reorientation of sorts towards the Western Hemisphere. Can you explain what that is and why it's important?
Yes, the military, every new administration, when it comes up with this document known as the National Defense Strategy. And that one is really the guiding principle, the guiding document for what the U.S. military will do for decades to come. And for the past decade or so, including under Trump 1.0, the focus was going to be on China. That is the pacing threat, as they say. And that is what the U.S. military has been working towards. What we've seen in the past 6 months is actually quite different. The U.S. has, really shifted focus, or at least started focusing more on the United States' southern borders to stop or reduce illegal immigration. He has carried out strikes in Venezuela, or rather ships and boats emanating from Venezuela, not in Venezuela themselves so far. And so this document is still being worked on. There are some who believe that the focus will actually change from China and Asia more towards the Southern Hemisphere. And that is a big shift, because if your focus is the Southern Hemisphere, you're probably not going to be able to counter China in Asia, where I think the expectation or belief of U.S. intelligence is that by 2027, Xi Jinping is going to be sort of in a position to want to be ready to take over Taiwan. And so it is a sea change. It would be quite dramatic. And it would once again sort of raise the question of, is the military meant to fight and protect overseas, or is it now looking more internally? And I think that would be sort of the latest evidence if indeed this National Defense Strategy document says that.
Yeah. I think it's worth underlining the fact that for a long time, Trump himself talked about a threat from China. Certainly, President Biden did as well and was reorienting his foreign policy that way. And to have this all just suddenly be dropped, it raises a lot of questions, both about focus, but then also about something like, we have a massive military. Like, if you're refocusing on just our corner of the world where the United States is, like, what does that mean for the state of the armed forces and maintaining it?
I think that is a great question, right? The U.S. military takes up, close to $1 trillion in the budget. And that is sort of on the understanding that the U.S. is, retooling, refitting its soldiers and sailors and airmen to fight or be ready to fight abroad. And if that focus turns internal, it really raises questions about what the U.S. military really is. Does it need, aircraft carriers? Does it need, these fancy jets that can, carry out long distance bombings? It will raise fundamental questions about what the U.S. military is and what it should be doing.
I have to talk to you about something else that's happening at the Pentagon, which is journalists like you who report on the military have been asked to sign a document about what you're doing and why. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, and I think it's, again, sort of important to look at the context of this. Secretary Hegseth, since he's come into office, has really taken a strong line against the press. One of the first things he did was remove a number of major outlets from their spaces within the Pentagon.
Yeah, the New York Times got kicked out. I'm not sure if you guys were as well.
The New York Times, CNN, Reuters was not, but New York Times, CNN, the Washington Post, and at least one other, and Politico were removed from their workspaces in the Pentagon. The Pentagon has restricted where we as journalists can go within the building. I know it might come as a surprise to many, but we could roam around pretty much anywhere in the building. We couldn't go into offices, of course, but we were free to roam the hallways. And so the latest sort of step in that has been essentially a document that journalists have been asked to sign that is sort of really problematic because it makes some suggestions that journalists acknowledge that unauthorized information cannot be released. As journalists, our job, of course, is not to let government decide what is or is not authorized, right? Because if there is a story that is, in the public interest, but makes the military look bad, the Pentagon might not want it to be out. And so it raises real fundamental free press concerns. I know free press advocates have talked about it. And it's one of those things that I think for a lot of reporters, which like a lot of what's going on in this atmosphere is really concerning.
When I asked if Reuters was planning to sign this agreement, Idris couldn't say. But it's clear from reporting in other news outlets that many news organizations are actively negotiating with the Department of Defense over journalistic access. How has all this changed how you think about your role as a Pentagon journalist?
It's something I've been thinking a lot about. The way Pentagon reporters used to do our jobs was to talk to service members, talk to people who were on the front lines in many cases when Afghanistan and Iraq wars were going on. Our job was to talk to the officials who were involved in it. And the atmosphere that's been created, take away sort of the physical constraints, but the secretary has said, create a real atmosphere where the press is seen as an adversary, where the press is seen as someone who should not be, or something that should not be trusted. And when you have that environment, I think it trickles down. I think most of our sources in the military respect the media, respect what the media does for readers around the world. But if your boss is setting that tone, the chances that you're going to want to talk just out of pure fear, I think, goes way down. And so it's challenging. We as journalists will adapt, undoubtedly. It'll require us, and it already has required us to be more creative. I think, unfortunately, the big losers in all of this are going to be the international audience and the American people. But we as journalists are sort of going to stay committed to it, be more creative, because one way or the other, information is going to come out.
You and I are talking around lunchtime on Tuesday. The speeches are over. But before he took to the stage, President Trump told reporters he would meet individually with some of the generals and admirals who had traveled to Virginia. And he was very clear that if he did not like them, he'd fire them on the spot. Is that something that could still happen today?
Look, with Trump, anything can happen. There's nothing on his schedule that would suggest that he is meeting with individual generals. He actually, after his speech, left the auditorium and headed back to the White House. And the secretary actually made clear that more changes would be coming to the military leadership. So I think we should stay tuned. I don't think it's necessarily imminent, but there have been days where I have woken up not expecting anything, and my sources haven't been expecting anything. And then the secretary has fired, a number of senior officials. So it's something that is quite honestly in the back of everyone's mind every day.
Idris, I'm so grateful for your time and your reporting. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Idris Ali is a national security correspondent at Reuters. And that's our show. What Next is produced by Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, and Madeline Ducharme. Paige Osburn is the supervising producer of What Next and What Next TBD. Mia Lobel is the head of audio at Slate. Ben Richmond is the senior director of podcast operations. And I'm Mary Harris. Go track me down on Blue Sky. Say, hey, I'm at Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. Catch you back here next time.